In August of 2005, a pale blue sedan was found idling near mile marker 12 on the Pacific Coast Highway. 2 phones on the console, wallets in the door pocket, engine still warm. But there were no footprints in the gravel, no keys, no people. Just a sea mist rolling through the cliffs and a wedding photo no one could quite place until 18 years later, when someone finally looked hard enough to see what was in the corner. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed close to your town or your life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Susan Halperin. I was 30 years old the summer Matt and Lacey went missing. Back then, I worked part-time in the Pacific Archives office out in Ventura. Not a glamorous job, just floor fans, old file cabinets, and a rotating cast of retirees chasing property maps or veterans' records. I remember thinking back then how peaceful that stretch of highway was. The way the fog curled around the coastal bluffs like a blanket. How it swallowed the noise. You could drive 10 miles without seeing another car, just waves folding into the rocks and eucalyptus trees leaning into the wind. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt untouched. We used to joke back before things changed that the ocean out there knew how to keep secrets. Folks would come out from Bakersfield, Modesto even farther just to stand at the lookout near marker 12 and breathe it in. There was nothing sinister about it. It was where people proposed, where retirees took photos with binoculars. Matt and Lacey Delmont had just gotten married up in Carmel. They were driving the coast on their way to Big Sur honeymoon road trip, the kind people dream about. Lacey's mom had brought their wedding photo into our office a week after they disappeared. Not for any official reason, she just wanted someone to have it on record just in case. She laid it down gently on the counter like it might still be warm. I remember the breeze had caught Lacey's curls in the photo. Her dress was simple. Matt had that look, arms open wide, like the world had finally opened with him. There was nothing unusual about that photo. Not then. The file was flagged. No crime, missing persons only. No blood. No struggle. No signs of foul play. That's what the CHP report said. But something always bothered me. They'd left both their phones in the car. Lacey's sunglasses, too, still folded on the dash. 2 half-empty water bottles in the cup holders. The driver's seat pushed back a little farther than Matt usually drove, according to his sister. There was no note, no broken glass, no tire marks in the gravel, just the wind and the soft hiss of waves down below. But here's what stuck with me all these years. That car was parked perfectly, not crooked, not rushed. Front tires lined exactly with the white shoulder line like someone had taken their time. And whoever that someone was, they never came back. Not the next day, not the next year, not ever. And then last summer, a retired highway officer came back into the archives office. He wasn't looking for much. Just said he couldn't sleep without seeing that photo again, the one we'd all stopped looking at. And that's when he saw it. Something, or someone, standing in the corner of the frame. That was the moment everything started to shift. I remember the first time I saw the Hartwell case folder. It was the summer of 2005, and the manila jacket looked no different than the rest smudged label black marker-typed names. But when I opened it, something about the quietness of it all stayed with me. No crash, no blood. Just a car left too carefully a couple who should have still been eating breakfast somewhere in Big Sur. Matt and Lacey Delmont had been married for 12 days. That detail was always underlined, spoken like it meant something. Like love should have protected them. And maybe it should have. But it didn't. I wasn't law enforcement. Just a clerk working back of house for the archives division. We didn't solve cases. We didn't even ask questions. We filed and refilled, logged property permits, public land assessments, construction clearances. But some cases never went quiet, even when the file drawers closed. This was one of them. That August morning, the marine layer had come in low, the kind that sticks to your clothes and dulls everything to gray. The Delmont's Camry was first spotted by a trucker around 6:17 a.m. pulled onto the shoulder near mile marker 12. I've driven that stretch. It's not much of a turnout. Just enough space to cut the wheel and let the engine cool. But the way it was parked nose square to the road 2 feet off the white line, that's what stayed with people. The trucker said it looked paused, like someone meant to come back. CHP officer Nicole Arrieta arrived a little before 10:00 a.m. Her report said the windows were up, doors locked. No obvious signs of struggle. Both cell phones still sitting in the center console. IDs in the side pocket. Half-drunk water bottles. No signs of violence. No signs of anything, really. The back seat was empty. The trunk was locked. Lacey's sunglasses were still on the dash. Nicole did what any good officer would do. She photographed the scene, logged the contents of the glove box registration listed to Matt Delmont, 29, of Santa Clarita. Passenger listed as Lacey Delmont, 27, recently married, maiden name Olin. No accident report. No missing tire tracks. No sign they'd walked into the brush. Just silence. Nicole noted one thing, though. Up the slope behind the turnout on the cliff wall, she saw something pressed into the dirt. Circular. Flat. It didn't look like tire tread or animal sign. More like someone had leaned something against the wall. Maybe equipment. Maybe nothing. Below it, scattered in the loose gravel, were crushed seashells. That detail always bothered me. That high up from the tide line, you don't see shells like that unless someone brings them there. By early afternoon, the vehicle was towed. Matt and Lacey were listed as missing. A bolo went out to local law enforcement, but nothing came in. They hadn't checked into a motel, hadn't made another blog post, no charges on their cards after August 2nd. That night, local news aired a photo of the couple on their wedding day. The same one Lacey's mother had shown me weeks later. Arms around each other, laughing into the wind, the Pacific behind them. The image ran for weeks. Posters, flyers, outreach groups. The media loved the poetry of it, 2 people in love swallowed by the fog. But no one caught the shadow in the photo. Not until years later. Not until a man named Hank Lane came back around. Now I'd met Hank once briefly. He was retired CHP, ran patrols up and down that coast longer than most rookies had been alive. By the time I saw him again in 2023, he walked with a hitch in his hip and wore the same windbreaker he probably had in '98. He came into the archives one morning and asked if the Delmont case had ever been digitized. I told him no, too old, too inactive. He didn't say much, just asked to see the original folder. I brought it out, and he laid everything across the table with this slow, deliberate care. He wasn't hunting. He was remembering. He spread the intake reports, search grids, copies of their wedding photo. And then he found the selfie, the last known image Matt had posted to their travel blog on August 2nd at 5:49 p.m. They were smiling, perched at a scenic overlook. The sea was behind them, sun in their eyes. But Hank didn't look at their faces. He squinted at the corner behind Lacey's right shoulder, a rock formation that didn't match anything near mile marker 12. A long, horizontal slab cracked at an angle half hidden by the edge of her wind-blown hair. Hank didn't say a word, just pulled out an old county coastal development map and traced his finger along the edge until he stopped roughly 3 miles south of where the car had been found. There'd been a service turnout there, he said, blasted into the cliff after a 2003 mudslide. Erosion had shut it down in 2006, but in 2005, it would have still been accessible. Hank circled the location and the date. August 2nd. If the photo was taken there, then the timeline never matched, because they weren't even near mile marker 12 when that photo was posted. The next morning, Hank drove it himself. No badge, no warrant. Just him and that same stretch of road he'd patrolled for decades. He didn't tell anyone he was going. I didn't know until later that he climbed the rusted chain at the gate and followed the old path by foot knees, protesting every step. But he found it the rock slab from the photo. Same angle, same elevation, same wind beating off the water. And at the base of that slab, mostly buried beneath silt and sea dust, was a lens filter. Canon 58mm, rusted, warped from the sun, and etched in faint, almost invisible scrawl along the rim were the words, E. Delmont, April 5th. The couple's missing electronics had been listed back in 2005. A Canon digital camera was one of them. That lens hadn't drifted there. It hadn't fallen from a cliff. Someone left it or lost it right where the photo was taken. 3 miles south of where the car had been found, which meant someone had moved that vehicle after the fact, placed it at mile marker 12 on purpose, and made sure nothing else was left behind. When Hank handed the evidence over to the sheriff's office that July, it didn't go straight to cold storage. It landed on the desk of Detective Eva Reyes. She'd taken over cold cases in San Luis Obispo County a few years earlier. Sharp mind, even sharper instincts. She wasn't one for lost causes, but she knew what to do with a puzzle that still had pieces to place. She examined the lens under lab light. Rusted metal rim, sand still wedged in the threads, faint scratch on the glass. But that inscription, that wasn't planted. That wasn't random. That was personal. And that was the moment this whole case came back to life. Because now we knew 2 things that no one had known in 2005. 1, Matt and Lacey had last been seen alive at a different location entirely. And 2, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure we never figured that out. What we didn't know yet was why. But something else was coming. Not a witness, not a breakthrough. Just a photo already sitting in the file all along. And in that photo, just beyond where Lacey smiled into the sun, someone else was there. Watching. Not posing, not waving, just standing, motionless, waiting for no one to notice. Until now. She enhanced the photo herself late that night in the cold case office after the others had gone home. The contrast had to be just right or you'd miss it again. Reyes adjusted the light balance, squinted against the glare of the screen, then leaned back as the figure came clearer in the shadows. Not between Matt and Lacey, but behind them, tucked just past Lacey's right shoulder in the brush above the overlook. At first glance, it still looked like a shadow. But as the enhancement held steady, it was clear someone had been standing there. Upright, motionless, partially blocked by coastal sage. He wasn't posing. He wasn't looking at the camera. But he was watching them. The photo was time-stamped, August 2nd, 5:49 p.m., less than 12 hours before their car turned up 3 miles north with no sign of either of them. And this person, whoever he was, hadn't been part of any theory. Not in 2005, not in the 18 years since. Reyes printed the photo in matte grayscale, trimmed the edges, and clipped it to the front of the folder. Then she sat there for a long time, elbows on the desk, letting the silence press in. That's when she remembered the note Hank Lane had mentioned during their call, the one that came with the old lens filter. He'd written possible photo analysis discrepancy and request reevaluation of MM12 as true site of disappearance. But that wasn't all. He'd also included one other item, an old blog entry printout. The last one Matt had posted before they vanished. Reyes flipped to the original case file. Back then, the couple had kept a travel blog. Something simple: photos, little journal updates from each stop along their honeymoon route. Most were typical captions about roadside diners, photos of motel keys, snapshots of Lacey's feet in the sand. But the final post, dated August 2nd, 9th, 17 p.m., had stood out even at the time. It was a Polaroid, not digital. Lacey had taken it on an instant camera and mailed it to her mom from Monterey. It arrived 2 days after they'd already been reported missing. The image showed the two of them seated outside a little cafe laughing. There was no timestamp beyond the blog entry, no metadata to trace. But on the back in Lacey's handwriting it read, "Wish you were here. We made it to the cliffs. Sunset tonight." Lovem Reyes stared at that line for a while. We made it to the cliffs. If that was the same location from the earlier photo, it wasn't mile 12. It was the unmarked service turnout farther south. She made a note in the margin of her folder and kept reading. Tucked behind the photo was a scan of a journal page sent by the family, a page from Matt's handwriting. He'd been documenting parts of the trip in a separate notebook, a habit apparently from his years as a junior surveyor. The page had one line circled in red. "We saw someone again. Same guy from the last turnout. He keeps pretending not to watch us. It's creeping him out. No name, no description. Just that." Reyes exhaled slowly. She got up and crossed the room to the file cabinet where they stored miscellaneous returns from unsolved cases, miscategorized items, things mailed back to families sometimes years too late. She unlocked drawer 4 and found the Delmont envelope. Inside were photocopies of a receipt, a motel key, and one more item that hadn't been documented clearly in the original evidence log. A hardware store receipt dated July 29, 2005, 4 days before the disappearance. Purchased 1 tarp, 1 coil of rope, flashlight batteries, utility gloves, and a folding spade. The name on the card, L. Granger. Reyes sat back down at her desk, pulled out her phone, and called the number Lane had scribbled on his note. He picked up on the second ring. "It's Reyes," she said. "I got your envelope." There was a pause on the line, then his voice low. "Figured you might. Where'd you find this? That old turnout they shut after the '06 landslide, south of 12. Never made it on the Caltrans maps. You're sure it's the place in the photo I stood there myself? Rock angle, horizon, same slab." She hesitated, watching the printout in her hand. And the filter, lying right under the ledge, just barely showing. That's not something you drop by accident, not 18 years ago. By the next morning, Reyes was already in her car, driving the coastal stretch from Big Sur to Cambria, retracing the couple's route. She stopped briefly at the original mile marker 12 site. It was quiet as always. Just cliffs and camera-toting tourists now. No sign it had once been a suspected crime scene. The shoulder had been repaved since then. She watched the sea for a few minutes, then moved on. The chain-link gate leading to the old service road was still there, sagging half-eaten by salt brush. A faded Caltrans sign hung crooked, road closed, unstable grade. She slipped through the gap and walked the length of the broken path. The wind picked up as she turned the bend and saw its same fractured rock slab, same line of horizon, same backdrop as the photo. She crouched at the base where Lane had found the filter brushed back a thin layer of sediment. Nothing else turned up, not right away. But she didn't need more. She already knew what the presence of that one object meant. Back at the department, she reopened the file officially. The original theory, the one from 2005, had assumed the Delmont slipped on a hike, that they'd fallen into the sea and their bodies had simply never washed up. Open-ended. No one had pushed for foul play. There'd been no motive, no enemies, no reason to think otherwise. But now that theory collapsed under its own weight, because they hadn't been at mile 12. The photo confirmed that. So did the lens. So did the shell fragments and the buried receipt. Someone had gone to great lengths to move that car and place it where it would throw off the timeline. And now, Reyes had something else to reckon with. She walked to the evidence cabinet and retrieved the original printout of the wedding photo, the one that ran in newspapers. She laid it under the forensic light and studied the edges, adjusted the filter settings, let the shadows deepen. There, between the couple, barely perceptible without enhancement, was that same figure, standing in the brush, watching. She printed a new copy and clipped it to the board. Later that week, Reyes drove out to Arroyo Grande to visit Lacey's mother. Margaret Delmont still lived in the same single-story house tucked in behind a row of aging bougainvillea. When Reyes introduced herself, Margaret didn't flinch. She just nodded and stepped aside. "You'll want tea," she said quietly. "People always do when they come to talk about Lacey." They sat at the kitchen table and Reyes spread out the new photos, careful not to crowd. "We've reopened the case," she said gently. "We found some inconsistencies." Margaret's eyes scanned the enhanced photo, the shadowed figure. Her hand moved to her mouth. "That wasn't there in the original," she murmured. Reyes shook her head. "It was always there. We just didn't see it. Not with the tech we had back then." Margaret stared for a long moment. "It's not Matt," she said quietly. "Not his build. Not how he stood." She stood and crossed the room to a drawer, pulling out a yellowed manila envelope. "I wasn't sure I should keep this," she said, "but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out." Inside were 2 Polaroids, the receipt, and a note in block letters. The first Polaroid matched the final blog entry. The second showed a close-up of Matt's notebook, that circled line again. Same guy from the last turnout. Margaret passed Reyes the receipt. It was in Matt's pack when they returned his things. They said it probably belonged to someone else. Reyes read the name again. L. Granger. The signature matched the card slip. That night back at her desk, Reyes entered the name into the county records database. It took almost an hour to find a hit. Louis Bernard Granger. Contractor. License expired. Former owner of a grading business that had worked landslide mitigation near that same stretch of road in 2004. Same area. Same dates. She pulled a blank case file, wrote the name across the top, and marked it Person of Interest. The feeling she had wasn't certainty, not yet, but it was something close. Because someone had been watching the Delmonts. Someone who had access to closed roads, heavy equipment, and a reason to make sure no one ever looked past the wrong mile marker. And now, 18 years later, that name had finally surfaced again. Not through a witness, not through a confession. Just a receipt someone forgot to file, or maybe hoped no one would ever read. The name gave us something, but it didn't give us direction. Louis Bernard Granger had left almost nothing behind. His contractor's license had lapsed. His business, Granger Coastal Repair and Grading, was dissolved 2 years after the Delmonts vanished. He had no listed dependents, no arrest record. He'd paid his taxes until 2006, then just stopped. On paper, he went dark the year after Matt and Lacey disappeared. No forwarding address, no property sales, no death certificate. His old worksite was listed as inactive commercial equipment yard located just off an inland turn near San Simeon. According to county records, the land had been forfeited for back taxes over a decade earlier. Still, it was the only physical lead we had. Reyes submitted a property access request, then didn't wait for a reply. She took the file, the photo, and the name, and drove north. The yard was quiet when she got there. Gate sagging between 2 rusted posts, padlock welded shut by salt air. Beyond it, cracked pavement gave way to dry brush and a scattering of dead machinery, old mixers, half-stripped graders, a tanker trailer folded in at one side. The whole place felt forgotten. She parked off the road and climbed the fence. Nothing moved. No birds, no wind. Just metal and dust. But toward the back, she found a long, low building sheet, metal walls warped by years of storms. The lock on the office door was corroded but still intact. She broke it with a pry bar and stepped inside. The air was thick. Mold-rot damp paper. Her flashlight cut through layers of stillness. On the desk, collapsed cardboard boxes, torn contractor logs, crumpled site maps. A Caltrans vest draped over a nail. Some of the paperwork was unreadable, but tucked in a wire rack beside the window was a weathered binder with a yellowing label, Job number 7405. Slope stabilization MM11 to MM13. Reyes opened it carefully. Inside were grainy site photos, dated checklists, handwritten margins full of truck logs and supply runs. Most of it was routine erosion control, culvert repair regrading shoulder lines. But one entry dated August 3, 2005 stopped her cold. Check turnout after rain. Tire ruts still visible. No work scheduled. Fresh boot prints beyond road line. Didn't report. That last part was underlined. Twice. She kept flipping. Under the final divider, she found a single sheet of lined notebook paper. Not part of the official logs. Folded once, then again. Inside a list. Names at the top. Matt Delmont, Lacey Delmont. Beneath them, what looked like surveillance notes, vehicle make and plate dates and locations, restaurant stops, trailhead entries. At the bottom, one final line written in a different pen, last seen, Aug 2nd sunset, saw camera. And then 3 words slightly slanted. They knew me. Reyes folded the note into an evidence sleeve and stood motionless in the dust for a long time. She had worked homicide, missing persons, domestic. But this was something different. Not spontaneous. Not random. Someone had been following Matt and Lacey, tracking them, keeping a record, and whoever had written that last line had watched it all fall apart the moment that photo was taken. She turned to leave, then stopped. Something shifted in the back room. Not loud, just a soft scrape metal on concrete. She stepped toward the sound, hand brushing the grip of her sidearm. The inner office door creaked as she pushed it wider. Inside, lit by a single beam from a cracked skylight, was a cot, thin blanket, an overturned can, a jar of peanut butter half empty, water jug by the wall. But what made her stomach turn was the dust, because the footprints in it were fresh. Back outside, she stood on the edge of the yard and radioed dispatch. She gave the address, requested a search unit, and flagged it for forensic sweep. Possible habitation. Possible suspect activity. When she hung up, she didn't get in her car. She walked the edge of the fence line, slow, quiet, listening to the wind. No sign of movement. But it didn't feel abandoned anymore. Someone had come back. Maybe recently, maybe often. Maybe they'd never really left. That night, Reyes spread the contents of the binder and the notebook page across her apartment floor. She pulled out the Delmont file and laid everything side by side, the wedding photo, the last blog image, the lens filter, the cafe Polaroid, the hardware receipt. She opened a new folder, labeled it Granger Lewis B., Person of Interest. She pinned the 3 words from the note in red ink. They knew me. It was the first time the case felt like it had weight again. Not just questions, but pressure. Like something that had been buried too deep was starting to shift. The next morning, she traced Granger's old permits. Between 1997 and 2002, he'd filed a dozen applications for small grading and erosion jobs along the PCH. Most were routine, but several mentioned private access spurs, unmarked service turnouts, usually temporary, created during storm damage work. She located 2 that hadn't been properly closed or inspected. Both were within a 4-mile radius of the fall scene at mile marker 12. Both had eroded significantly by 2007. One was the turnout where the photo had been taken. The other she wasn't sure yet. At 10:12 p.m., she stood in her living room surrounded by maps, evidence bags, and half-faded photos. She hadn't turned the television on in days. A printout of the last blog photo sat under a lamp. Matt and Lacey whined in their hair C at their backs, and behind them now undeniable a figure watching from the brush. She stared at the shape until her eyes burned. It wasn't sharp, not detailed, but the posture, the stillness, the way the shoulders set there was something deliberate in it. Not curiosity, not coincidence. Presence. She didn't know yet what Granger had done. Or why. But she knew this much. That turnout hadn't been chosen by accident. That photo wasn't just a keepsake, it had caught something. A moment Granger hadn't meant to preserve. And that was the moment the game shifted. Because someone else had seen it. Someone had gone back, maybe even recently. Maybe still now. And what had started as a disappearance, just two people gone without a trace, was starting to look more like something planned. Watched. Controlled. Maybe even repeated. What Reyes didn't know yet, not fully, was that the pattern hadn't ended with Matt and Lacey, and the trail they left behind wasn't finished. It was still unfolding, one footprint at a time. The map Reyes had been building was less of a trail and more of a lattice, offshoots, redundancies, dead ends. But some of those dead ends didn't sit right. She went back through the maintenance permit records and found that one of Granger's old projects, a short-term slope stabilization job just north of Harmony, had no final inspection report, no completion date. The notes just stopped in April of 2006, 4 months before Matt and Lacey vanished. The site was listed as decommissioned but still accessible by service road. That gave her a direction. It was late afternoon by the time she pulled off the highway. The service road was mostly washed-out patches of gravel clinging to hard clay weeds pushing through the center. About half a mile in the incline dropped suddenly, and a narrow turnout opened against a ridge. From the road it looked like nothing. A trick of shadow, maybe. But once she stepped out and walked the curve, it was clear the space had been carved deliberately. A shoulder wide enough for 2 vehicles cut into the hillside and boxed in by brush and low stone. At the far end, near the drop-off, someone had driven rebar into the soil. 2 posts, bent backward, rusted at the joints, like something had been mounted there once, maybe a temporary guardrail, or a winch, or a tether. She walked the length of the turnout slowly. No tire tracks, just patches of moss and gravel disturbed by rain. But at the base of the eastern slope, near the tree line, she noticed a faint depression in the soil, like a trench had been filled and packed down. She knelt, brushing the surface with her glove. Clay broke loose, easily, crumbling along a sharper edge than nature usually leaves. She flagged it with a marker and stepped back. From there, the shape was clearer, maybe 4 feet wide, 6 feet long. Shallow, but clean. She didn't dig, not yet, but she took photos, logged coordinates, called it in as a possible concealed feature pending ground radar. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table tracing everything they had. Matt's missing camera, Lacey's final blog entry, Granger's notes, the uninspected sites, the half-buried turnout. There was no confirmed link yet, no forensic match. But a shape was beginning to emerge. Not just of a location, but of a pattern. And it wasn't limited to Matt and Lacey. Reyes remembered something from the early files. A reference made by one of the retired rangers during the initial canvassing. Back in '06, a local college student had gone missing a few months before the Delmonts camped solo just off the same corridor. His name was Emery Pace. His case hadn't drawn much attention. No foul play was confirmed. He'd just been listed as presumed missing in wilderness conditions. But when she looked him up again, she found something strange. His last confirmed location was also logged near mile marker 12.4. His vehicle had been found 3 days later. Parked, locked, no sign of struggle. But the ranger who found it had noted something in the original field report, mud caked into the sidewall tread. Not from the trail, from somewhere off-road. The tire model matched what was listed in Granger's job site requisition from that same season. It was thin, circumstantial, but something about it felt too aligned to ignore. Reyes made the call the next morning. The Pace family still lived in Pacific Grove. His younger sister Laurel answered. She was 23 when her brother disappeared. 38 now. Reyes explained who she was, what she was working on, and asked if Laurel had kept any of Emery's things. After a long pause, Laurel said she had. A few boxes, mostly journals, receipts, and old flip phone that had never been unlocked. Reyes drove out that afternoon. The house was small, coastal painted blue-gray porch, wind-chimed and tidy. Laurel met her at the door with a cardboard box held against her chest like it might fall apart. She didn't speak much, just handed it over, nodded once, and sat on the step while Reyes leafed through. Most of it was as described. Maps, trail notes, a broken wristwatch. But near the bottom was a film envelope unmarked, no negatives, just a strip of developed 35mm stills, slightly curled. Reyes held them to the light one by one. Most were nature shots, trees, sky, and old bridge. But the second-to-last frame stopped her. In the left foreground, partially obscured by scrub, was a figure. Out of focus, but standing still, looking toward the camera. Reyes angled it again under the porch light. She couldn't see a face, but the stance was familiar. Squared shoulders, feet close, hands not visible, the same bearing, same outline as the figure behind Matt and Lacey in the blog photo. She asked if Laurel had ever seen this shot before. Laurel shook her head. Said Emery had only brought back one roll that summer. The rest, she assumed, were lost with him. Reyes slid the strip into an evidence sleeve and thanked her. As she walked back to the car, she noticed something else. Laurel's front fence had fresh nails in it. Reinforced latches. A second motion light mounted above the mailbox. When she asked, Laurel only said, "They've come around before." Men asking questions. Always about Emery. But they never left cards. That night, Reyes laid the two photos side by side on her coffee table. Emery's still and Lacey's blog shot. Different days, different cameras, same location, same posture, and likely the same man. She called in for digital enhancement. Nothing dramatic, just contrast lifts and exposure checks. The tech came back quiet. Said the jacket visible on the figure in both frames matched a common Carhartt model sold between 2001 and 2006. Color faded brown. Standard collar, the kind Granger had been wearing in his old license photo, the one from the binder. By the time Reyes returned to the turnout the next morning with ground radar, a cold front had rolled in. Fog clung to the slope and pooled near the road. The crew moved slow, marking readings, checking anomalies. Around 11:30 a.m., the lead technician waved her over. Under the spot she'd flagged roughly 2 feet down was a disruption consistent with a buried object. Elongated, densely packed, man-made contours. He couldn't confirm it was a body, but he couldn't rule it out. Reyes stood over the site with the fog thick at her ankles and felt the quiet settle in again. The same silence from the yard, from the photo, from the missing years in Granger's records. It wasn't confirmation, not yet. But the ground remembered, even when everyone else had moved on. What Reyes couldn't know then, what wouldn't surface until later, was that someone else had been watching the turnout too. Someone who hadn't forgotten. Someone who had started to move again. The radar confirmation gave us cause, but not clearance. The soil anomaly had to be documented, photographed, logged with county zoning before we could request excavation. Red tape moved slow, and I knew we had maybe a few days before word spread. Once it did, anyone with an old grievance or a badge long since handed in would start sniffing around. So I went quiet. I didn't tell the precinct, not yet. I pulled the original ranger reports again, every oddity logged between 2004 and 2007. People heard in the trees, lights off the ridgeline, cases that were marked unsubstantiated, mostly missing time, disoriented hikers, the kind of stuff you'd chalk up to exhaustion or sunstroke. But one account stood out. Dated August 2005, filed by a woman named Darla Chen. She'd been camping solo 3 miles north of where Emery disappeared. Her report was thin. She left early, cut the trip short after a man watched her sleep. That was her phrasing. Not a man walked past, not a man approached. Just that, watched her sleep. She woke up and he was crouched near the tent flap. Didn't speak, didn't move. Just watched. When she shouted, he backed off slowly like he'd rehearsed the exit. I called the contact number listed, not expecting it to still work. But she answered. Still lived in Auburn. Said she remembered every second. She'd left that morning, drove straight home, never went back. It was the way she described his posture that unsettled me. She said he didn't crouch like someone startled. He crouched like someone hiding, balanced, familiar with the shape of the dark. When she yelled, he didn't run. Just rose calmly like there was no need to rush. That matched something I hadn't voiced yet, not to anyone. In both photos, the figure behind Lacey and the one in Emery's frame, the man stood exactly the same. No urgency, no blur of motion, still balanced, centered, as if the moment had been chosen, not stumbled into. I thanked Darla and hung up. Then I started calling equipment rental outfits, ones that had serviced Harmony Twain Hart and Columbia between 2003 and 2008. I didn't say the name Granger. I just asked if anyone had ever rented bore kits or trench shoring to solo operators. One guy remembered something. Said a man used to come in every summer, cash only rented small batch soil stabilizers and portable tampers. Said he was polite, quiet, always wore gloves, thought he might have been a contractor. Said the name on the rental form was different every year. But the handwriting never changed. When I asked for copies, he hesitated. Said most of those records were gone burned when they moved warehouses, but he gave me the address of the old storage yard out past Sonora. Told me if anything survived, it'd be in the back file trailer. So I drove out, flashed a badge that barely mattered anymore, and asked the guy on site if I could look. He shrugged, pointed toward a white prefab unit with a rusted lock. Inside it smelled like old paper and coolant. Filing cabinets, half-pulled records, sun-faded and mouse-chewed. But toward the back, under 2006 equipment logs, I found a folder labeled SR, inside rental forms for trench shields, hand augers, and a soil compactor. Customer signature block, Samuel Reed. Not Granger. But the pen pressure, the block lettering, even the slant on the S, it was a match for the permit logs I'd been studying. Whoever Samuel Reed was, he'd rented just enough equipment to dig and fill a shallow trench. The dates lined up with the weekend Matt and Lacey vanished. I photocopied the forms, drove home with the windows down, trying to ground myself in something normal. The air smelled like pine tar and distant rain. But as I turned into my street, something changed. My porch light, which I always left off, was on, and the chair near the railing one I never used had been pulled 2 feet forward. Not dramatically, not tipped, just moved, like someone had sat there waiting. I parked across the street and watched the house for 20 minutes. No movement, no figures. Just the light, the chair, and the faint scrape mark left where the leg dragged across concrete. I unlocked the front door, slowly checked every room, every closet. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No prints I could lift. But in the kitchen, next to the coffee pot, was a yellow legal pad. One sheet torn, the rest clean. I never owned one. And on the torn sheet, pressed hard enough to leave indentations, was a partial imprint. I couldn't read it, not directly, but I used a pencil to shade over the top page. The pressure marks slowly formed the words, "It's not just them." I stared at that for a long time. Not because it answered anything, but because it introduced something new. A change in voice. A message not meant to scare, but to warn. I locked the house down and slept in my car that night, parked at the precinct lot under the motion cameras. In the morning, I went back to the turnout. I needed to see it again in daylight. But as I approached, I saw something else, a tire track. Shallow new. Not from our radar truck. Something narrower. Passenger vehicle. And next to the tree line where I'd flagged the trench site, Someone had placed a single object, a glove. Brown canvas, left-facing, fingers curled, like it had been dropped deliberately but not discarded. I didn't touch it. I photographed it from every angle, then called in a forensics tech. While we waited, I scanned the perimeter again. No other footprints, no wrappers, no cigarette ends. But near the edge of the turnout, wedged into the bark of a cedar, was a sliver of red tape. Surveyor's kind. No writing. Just a marker. Folded once, tied low, then left. I flagged it, logged it, and waited. When the tech finally arrived, he crouched by the glove and nodded. Said it looked fresh. Maybe set out that morning. No rain on it. No insects yet. I didn't say what I suspected. That someone was using the site the way a hunter uses bait. Not to mark territory, but to control a story. To let someone know they were being watched, too. That night, I reviewed all 3 names, Emery, Matt, Lacey, and pulled up their case timelines side by side. There was a pattern, but it wasn't chronological. It was geographic. They'd all crossed a specific strip of land near mile marker 12.4, a patch of forest that wasn't public land but wasn't marked private either. Zoned under an LLC with no listed owner. Registered to a holding group based out of Bakersfield. When I traced the filings back, I found a transfer dated January 2004 from a contractor named Granger Property Works, signed by proxy. The LLC had acquired 5 parcels that month, all undeveloped, all steep, all situated just above water runoff paths, and all perfectly positioned to hide something if you knew how the land moved. I sent it all to the DA's office quietly through an old contact I trusted, and I requested a search warrant for the shallow trench. But part of me already knew the shape it would reveal, not because I'd seen it, but because someone else wanted it found now. Not hidden, not destroyed, exhumed, like it was part of a larger message. And I hadn't yet figured out who the message was really for. The warrant came through early on a Thursday, signed off by Judge Lancaster with a clause for immediate execution. We met the excavation crew at the turnout just after sunrise, the air still holding that dry, pine-scented chill you only get in the foothills before the sun climbs. I stood off to the side with Dalton, one of the younger deputies, while the foreman outlined the dig parameters with his crew. He asked if we were expecting bones or a septic tank. I told him to treat it like a burial site, quietly, no press, no chatter on the scanners. They cleared a 10 by 10 section around the flagged trench and started in slow brushing back the pine needles and topsoil layer by layer. We didn't find anything at first. The readings had suggested something shallow, maybe a disturbance 6 to 8 feet across. But 3 hours in the backhoe struck something firm, not stone wood. They stopped immediately and we moved in. What they'd hit wasn't a casket or a box. It was a plywood lid sealed with rusted nails and buried about 4 feet down. The foreman pried it loose, and the smell that rose up was unmistakable. Not fresh death, not decay, but rot held in, like something had been sealed for years without air. Inside the box were 3 bundles wrapped in dark plastic, taped tight. The kind of industrial trash bags you'd buy in bulk if you knew exactly what you were doing. The first bundle contained clothing, torn water-stained but intact enough to identify. A zip-up hoodie size small, a graphic tee, jeans, women's cut. The hoodie matched the description Lacey Meyer's parents had given. The second bundle was smaller, heavier tools. A trenching spade, a soil auger, both wiped mostly clean but showing signs of corrosion. The third bundle was what brought everything to a halt. Beneath the layers of plastic was a stack of cassette tapes, 12 in total, each one labeled only with a date. The earliest was marked 7/09/04, the latest 11/22/06. One of the evidence techs opened the case on the first tape and held it up to the light. The ribbon looked intact, no mold, no snap. We tagged everything, boxed it for chain of custody, and sent it straight to the lab in Modesto. They couldn't prioritize it too much backlog, but I had a friend down there, a guy named Herrera who owed me a favor from a case in Stockton. I asked him to pull the audio if he could. He said he'd try. While we waited, I drove back through the parcels listed under the holding company tied to Granger Property Works. One of them had a small access road that looped behind a hill out of view from the highway. I parked at the edge of the public land and walked in, cutting through brush until the tree line opened up. That's where I found the slab. Concrete maybe 10 by 10 feet, cracked at one corner, overgrown around the edges. It didn't look like a foundation, more like a cover. But there were no hinges, no handles, just a steel ring bolted flush to the center, rusted but solid. I didn't try to lift it, not alone. I took photos, marked the GPS, and flagged it for follow-up. But the moment I stepped off the slab, I heard movement in the trees. It wasn't an animal, no crashing, no scramble, just the sound of something shifting weight, measured, pausing. I stood still, hand near my sidearm, but didn't draw. After about 30 seconds, the sound stopped. I walked straight back to my car and didn't look back. That night, Herrera called. He'd run the first tape, told me I needed to hear it myself. I drove down the next morning and sat in his office while he queued up the file. The recording was grainy distant. No clear voices at first, just ambient sound, wind branches, maybe water. Then a click. A shift in mic level, and a voicemail speaking slowly. "This is the second attempt," he said. Subject did not respond to verbal prompt. Silence. Then a different voice, female, weak, barely audible. "Where is Matt?" she asked. Then static. The tape ran for another 47 minutes. Intermittent sounds, some speaking, most of it muffled, hard to make out. But the timestamps matched the week Lacey disappeared. I asked Herrera to isolate the voices, clean them up if possible. He said it would take time. I told him to keep going. I drove back to Tuolumne County and filed the report under restricted access. "Only 3 people saw it, me Dalton and our lead prosecutor. We agreed to keep it sealed until the full contents were verified." But it didn't stay quiet. That evening, I got a call from a blocked number. The voice on the line was low, deliberate. "You're pulling at the wrong thread," he said. "The boy was never in the ground." I asked who it was, but the line clicked off. I traced the number burner phone, no metadata, pinged off a tower near Columbia, and vanished. I didn't tell Dalton. Not yet. But I did call the Meyer family and asked if they could come in. We sat in interview room 2, no recording, just a conversation. I showed them the clothing from the trench. Marla Meyer nodded slowly, then covered her mouth. Greg just stared. Said nothing for a full minute. Then he asked if we'd found her. I said we found evidence of her. That's all I could say. He nodded again, like he'd already expected that answer. Before they left, Marla said something I hadn't considered. She said Lacey had been afraid of the woods for weeks before she went missing. Said she kept hearing her name at night. Whispered, not shouted. She thought it was someone from her school at first. But then it started happening when she was alone, even inside, even with the windows closed. I asked why she didn't report it. Marla said they didn't believe her. Thought it was stress. I wrote that down word for word. Not because I doubted her, but because it matched what I'd seen in the tapes, the way Lacey's voice broke when she asked about Matt. Like she wasn't just afraid, like she'd heard things no one else did. Herrera called 2 days later. Said tape 6 had something different, something that didn't belong. Halfway through, there was a change in background tone. A hum. Electrical. Not from the tape machine, like it was recorded near a substation or a battery stack. He looped it, boosted it, filtered the low end. Said it was consistent with older backup power systems, the kind used in bunkers, or underground labs, or old municipal facilities with no grid tie. He asked if that meant anything. I told him yes. Then I drove back to the concrete slab parked out of view and walked the perimeter again. This time I brought bolt cutters and a ground sensor. I didn't try to force the slab not yet, but I marked the soil depth and logged the vibration response. There was space beneath, air-pocketed, man-made, maybe 10 feet down. I walked back to the car without incident, but taped to my windshield was a note, folded, sealed in a sandwich bag. Inside, typed on plain printer paper, was a question: "Do you remember 1993? The date didn't connect at first. Not to this case, not directly. But that night I pulled the archive drive and searched every missing persons file from that year. 3 names came up, 2 resolved, 1 still open. A boy named Ethan Pollard, last seen in Modesto. Age 9. Description: small, thin build. Last confirmed sighting hiking trail near the upper reservoir, same park system. Never found. I stared at the entry for a long time. Then I went back to Herrera's audio files and pulled the voice sample from the second tape. The male voice, calm, unhurried. I played it side by side with the one from tape 6. They were close, too close to dismiss. Same pacing, same cadence. If it was Ethan, he'd be in his late 30s now. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of what I'd heard, but because of what I hadn't. That hum, that question, that voice on the phone saying the boy was never in the ground. It was a trail we hadn't followed, buried under another story. And someone out there still knew exactly where it led. Herrera called again 3 days later, just after noon. He said, "You need to come down. There's something on tape 9 you're not going to want over the phone." I made the drive in just under 3 hours, stopping only once for gas and a coffee I barely touched. His office lights were off when I arrived. Blinds drawn, door already cracked open like he'd been waiting. The cassette deck was already cued. He didn't say anything, just hit play. The first 30 seconds were quiet, ambient, no voices. Then a single tone like a sine wave dropped into the mix. Herrera leaned over and said, "Listen, just past the 42-second mark." I did. That's when I heard it. A sequence of taps, 5, then 3, then a pause, then 5 more. Not random, not background noise. It was deliberate. I jotted the pattern on a notepad and it hit me before I even finished the last line. Morse. And not just letters. Coordinates. We cross-checked the sequence against a topographic map. It lined up with the southern edge of the Granger parcel, the same site with the concrete slab, but not the slab itself. A few hundred yards east, tucked into a ridge that hadn't been disturbed in years. Herrera isolated. The sound again filtered out the background and confirmed that just before the tapping stopped, there was a voice. A whisper. Female. 2 words. "Still here." That's all. I called Dalton and told him to prep another search request. We couldn't push for a full warrant without more, but we could log a conservation inspection, especially with a recorded anomaly suggesting possible illegal structures underground. He met me just before sundown with 2 flashlights and a seismic sensor. No uniforms. No vehicle markings. We went in through the tree line following the GPS marker Herrera helped pin. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the outcrop. There was no visible entrance. No path. Just a natural depression in the rock half covered by dried brush. I stepped in first and felt it hollow beneath. Not a cave. Constructed. The edge of metal under stone. We pulled the debris back, revealing a rusted panel with a keypad mounted flush into the steel. No labels, no handle. The keypad had 6 digits worn down more than the others, 1, 4, 7, 9, 2, and 5. Dalton tried a few combinations from known property codes, nothing. Then I remembered the note. "Do you remember 1993 I punched it in?" The panel beeped once, then clicked. The door didn't swing open. It dropped. Straight down like an elevator lock releasing. We braced ourselves and pulled. It was heavier than it looked. Behind it was a narrow shaft, just tall enough to crouch into, leading to a ladder welded to the interior wall. We went one at a time. The air changed halfway down, cooler, stale, but dry. No rot. At the bottom was a chamber, poured concrete, no windows, no lights, just the glint of metal racks and file drawers. And in the far corner a folding chair with restraints bolted to the arms. No one else, no signs of life. But the walls were lined with shelves, boxes, tapes, hundreds of them. We didn't touch anything then, just took photos, logged GPS, called it in. By the time the forensics unit arrived, the sun had dropped and fog was rolling in through the trees. I waited by the trailhead while the team descended. They were down there nearly 2 hours. When the lead technician came back up, she was pale. Said there were names written on the file boxes, dozens of them. Some labeled resolved, some pending, some just unknown. One box was marked EM93. I didn't have to open it to know what that meant. Ethan Pollard. That was the year. That was the voice. I asked her to secure it under separate custody chain of command direct to the DA's office. We sealed the shaft and logged it as a state-level crime scene. No press, no statement. Not yet. That night I got a voicemail. No caller ID, no transcript. Just a voice I hadn't heard in years. A man. Calm. Even. "I see you found the other room," he said. "You're late. They're gone now." Click. That was it. I traced what I could, but it dead-ended again. I called in a favor from a retired profiler I knew in Sacramento. She used to consult on cases like this low-visibility trafficking operations underground systems, built not to move people but to erase them. Her name's Deidre Mallon. I gave her the tape fragment, the coordinates, the photos. 2 days later, she flew in. We met in the records room at the county building away from the main offices. She laid out her theory like she'd seen it before. Said the site was a cache point, a midpoint. Not where the original events happened, but where they were processed, documented, preserved. Whoever built it wasn't doing it alone. This wasn't the work of one person. She said the absence of bodies was intentional. That we were meant to find the tapes, but not the people. The point wasn't burial. It was erasure through record-keeping. Proof, but only for the right eyes. I asked her how many other cases she'd seen that looked like this. She didn't answer directly. Just said the kind of infrastructure we saw down there took years to build and longer to protect. She showed me a list of names from the unresolved box, at least 4 matched missing persons from California alone. One of them was from Sonora. A girl named Hannah Wells went missing in 2001, same age bracket, same school district as Lacey. Her file had been cold for over a decade. But there it was, her name handwritten in marker on the spine of a tape labeled HW12. Deidre asked if I wanted to listen. I said no, not yet. I needed to see the rest first. We pulled every tape from the unknown box and had Herrera run the first 5. 3 were blank. 1 had ambient sound for nearly an hour. Then a single line. "We are what you remember." The last had no audio, but the waveform showed a consistent pulse like a heartbeat recorded in isolation. I stayed in the sound room until nearly 3 a.m., cycling through the logs comparing timestamps. Each entry had a corresponding date, but not always a name. Some were labeled with just symbols. One tape had a red circle drawn on the spine. Another had 3 dots in a line. We flagged those for separate review, but something about the pattern started to make sense. These weren't trophies. They were echoes, replications of control. The recordings weren't for the abductors. They were for someone else. A third party. Maybe a buyer, maybe a handler, but not the one doing the actual harm. We couldn't make that public. Not yet. But we compiled enough to reopen 7 cases. That was the threshold we needed to escalate to the State Bureau. They sent a field agent within 36 hours. His name was Colton Reyes, mid-50s former military, not big on small talk. He walked the site with me, reviewed the chamber photos, and asked only one question. "Did any of your missing kids come back?" I told him no. Not a one. He nodded, like that confirmed something. Said the answer was in the gap, not the record, and that most places like this had more than one entrance. Before he left, he handed me a small manila envelope. Said it came from an old case out of Oregon. Inside was a photo, grainy, zoomed in. A girl standing in the background of a gas station shot. Windbreaker. Dark hair. Holding a cassette tape. The timestamp was 2007. The girl was Lacey. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. She wasn't looking at the camera. She wasn't smiling. She was handing the tape to someone just out of frame. And for the first time in 2 years, I realized something we'd never considered. Maybe the tapes weren't left behind. Maybe they were delivered, one by one, across years, across states, a message from the ones we lost, or the ones who were made to remember. We kept the investigation open for another 18 months. Reyes stayed in touch for the first few, passing along updates from state and federal task forces, most of it off the record. Several counties reopened missing persons cases that had gone dormant for decades. A few families got calls they never thought would come. I testified twice, once in front of a state review board, once in a closed-door session with a joint agency team out of D.C. They asked about the tapes, the site, the voice recordings. They asked if I believed the girl in that gas station photo was Lacey. I told them I did. Not because I could prove it, but because some part of me always knew we'd never find her where we were looking. Not in a shallow grave. Not behind a false wall. She didn't vanish. She was taken. And somewhere, somehow, she found a way to speak. The shaft site was eventually filled and sealed. Officially, it was classified as an unauthorized storage bunker tied to historical land misuse. No arrests were made, no charges filed. Not yet. Reyes said that might change in time, but that cases like this were like pulling a thread from the middle of a rug. You never knew how far it would go before something else unraveled. The tapes were moved to a secure archive. I never asked where. I didn't want to know. What mattered was that someone else was listening now. Someone with more reach, more resources, maybe even the authority to do what we couldn't. Herrera eventually moved back west. Said it was getting too heavy. Dalton stuck around, but he didn't talk about the case anymore. Not even off the record. And me, I still check that voicemail from time to time. The one with the voice saying, "You're late. They're gone now." I don't know who he was. I don't know who he meant by they. But I know this much: not everyone in that network was lost. Some were watching, some were recording, and some maybe were still trying to be found. There's a shelf in my home office where I keep the notes from those 2 years' field maps transcribed. Morse patterns, even a copy of the photo Reyes gave me. I look at it sometimes before bed. Not out of grief anymore. Out of obligation. Lacey was real. Hannah was real. Ethan, all of them. Their names didn't disappear just because their faces aged out of the flyers. Somewhere out there, someone still remembers them. And that has to mean something. If you're listening to this, if any part of this story felt familiar or close or wrong in a way you couldn't quite name, say something. Even if it's just in the comments. Even if it's been years. Stories like this don't end when the trail goes cold. They end when no one looks back. So if this one stayed with you, consider sharing it. So no name gets left behind.